Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Hanne Dalmut, Concordia's Senior Director of Partnerships, and our esteemed panel.
All right. Well, welcome everyone, and welcome to our panelists. I'm so pleased that this discussion on ag tech and food security gets to immediately follow that great session with Nate and Bill, especially thinking through the role of entrepreneurs. We had earlier this really fantastic roundtable between SAS and Rubicon on this very exact subject. So it's just really wonderful to be bringing some of that highlight into this stage and building on that discussion. So today's conversation is going to speak to the current state of food security and supply chains in the United States. We'll touch on partnerships to increase accessibility, strengthening food supply chains, and the use of innovative agriculture technology in ensuring food security. All in, I'm told, 18 minutes. So we'll get to it. Allow me to please introduce my panel. We have the Honorable Aurelia S. Giacometto. She's the co-founder and general counsel of AVC Global, Inc. We have Jonathan Webb, founder and CEO of App Harvest, and Paula Henderson. She's the executive vice president and chief supply officer for the Americas unit of SAS Institute. Let's dive into it. Nate teed us up, actually, because he talks a lot about data and the role of its impact in this discussion set. So Paula, let's shift to you. Talk to us a bit about how data and analytics can be used to close gaps in the food supply chain and ensure food security here in the U.S.
I'd love to, thank you. And so grateful to be with everyone. This is something that we are very passionate about at SAS. As you all know, here in the U.S., food producers grow enough food to feed our families twice really what they need. And it's pretty incredible to look at how much food is wasted globally. It's a $2.6 trillion problem. And so we have really formed a team to look at how can you harness data at a much more faster pace, recognizing how serious the problem is. And it's all in an effort with how you can ensure the right food is in the right place at the right time. And we take an approach that's not a generalist approach. We really have made investments with industry domain, recognizing the importance of incorporating different fields of science and people that understand the overall ecosystem of ag as we develop computer models. And we feel very strongly that you need that industry IP-rich modeling in order to solve these types of problems. And so one example that we were talking about earlier today, all around perishable goods, is with the cold chain logistics issue. And there's a lot that can be done with harnessing data in this area in order to ensure product quality and to make sure that, again, the right food is in the right place at the right time. So very exciting.
Yeah. Well, we'll definitely want to talk a bit about some of those solutions, right food, right place, right people, right time. But you put out a very scary number in your opening sentence, 2.6 trillion.
Yes.
There's this stat about, I'm not going to get the number right, so don't quote me on this, but roughly 3 trillion are needed for the Sustainable Development Goals each year, right? And so closing that gap with food security could really just accelerate a lot of progress in a lot of areas. Where does that gap come from, yes. Aurelia? In some of your previous work, you focused on environmentally sustainable crops and increased soil health. So you've seen kind of the gamut of the production side. What are some of the improper practices? What's driving that gap? Lessons learned for the audience. Where would you like to see things change?
I'd say, Hanne, that is a hot potato.
$2.6 trillion question.
That is a hot potato that you're tossing my way. And talking
Excellent food pun, by the way. We can do as many food puns in this panel as we can.
Then point one for me. So thinking about my time when I was at Monsanto and was using science to develop crops that could feed more people using less resources. And one of my most interesting yet frustrating roles was trying to address the hunger issues that were in Africa. And that is how I ended up here at University of Kentucky's Law School. It was really to try to find ways to address the issues that were, the laws that were problems in the African countries. And so let me give a little bit of an example of what an improper practice was. And that was really when I saw that it was using the science that was distorted and manipulated by politicians to fit a particular agenda, and it wasn't allowing the science to speak for itself. And so when you have the science, it's using it to inform what decisions that you need to make. And so when we were looking at what does that information tell us? And we saw that, and I'll just give an example. So when you had the European Union and they signed world trade agreements with the US, they found that their farmers could not compete with the American farmers and the American ranchers. So they drummed up questions about genetically modified organisms in order to find a way to prevent agriculture industry from the US entering into those European markets. And then what we saw happen was they went to Africa, and those same policies and laws were then enacted and adopted in African countries. And that prevented the American agriculture industry from entering those African markets. And it's no different than when you look at politicians and political candidates. They start trash talking one another. There's one item that ends up sticking. And when that item sticks, it goes viral. And when that happens, it all of a sudden becomes a truth that's unquestioned. And when that happens, it's just accepted. And so that was where you see, how do you actually peel that back? And that is where we ended up saying, okay, let's really look at the laws to see what they're actually saying and how that's actually harming the African economies and the African people, because it was more or less a business proposition in order to protect the farmers. And so that was one of the things that we ended up seeing was we really want to find ways to enable the markets to speak for themselves and let the science be the basis of that.
Was that trying to block GMOs into Africa? Is that what you're referring to?
Blocking the GMOs into Africa, and for
genetically
modified crops, genetically modified organisms. And for example, like you'll see today, one of the projects, when I was director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I approved a policy that enabled the planting of GMO crops on the lands. And that was where farmers were responsible for leaving at least 20% of their yield in the field on some of these federal lands, because it ended up being food for the migratory birds as well as the local wildlife. And there became a huge food source. And the reason why I authorized that was because the science said it was so. And to bring this back full circle, you look at, I know some people are going to say, it's bad, GMOs are bad for you. And then I would say, I read about Europeans and they used to think that the world was flat. But the science proved that wrong too. And now Monsanto was acquired by a European company named Bayer. That European company now owns those genetically modified crops and organisms, and they're being sold around the world.
Bayer is a great global patron member of Concordia. So I love that, though, that idea that let the science speak for itself as we think through policies, processes, systems that also accept the full holistic approach to food production and distribution. Jonathan, as an entrepreneur, what truth did you question when you thought App Harvest?
Well, some of what was meant, so we throw away 40 to 50% of our food in the US. We import 2/3 of our fruits and vegetables. We're the largest economy in the world, yet we import 2/3 of our fruits and vegetables. We're shipping it 2,000 and 3,000 miles. You start to question why. You look at, maybe in the 1800s when, railroad and we shipped from California to New York for leafy greens, that made sense. But, we've moved a long way from the early 1900s, and we haven't really radically evolved our farming methods with technology, whether it's robotics, AI, big data. In some ways we have, but in other ways, not nearly as aggressive as we could have. And then the startling facts that we need 50, 70% more food by 2050, and I mentioned earlier, some say we need 2 planet Earths to have enough land and water to grow that food, factoring in climate disruption and other variables. So ultimately, I think Nate was here before, and hats off to Nate to bring this group together. Any entrepreneur, our job is to try to, one, look at the problem, but then try to figure out how to build a business around it. And unfortunately for agriculture, the problems are very steep. But fortunately, there's incredible technologies and methods, and they're just not being utilized. And so we have a lot of progress we can make in a short amount of time, simply just with execution at scale. And that's what we at App Harvest are doing.
That's great.
And then just to piggyback on that, it is that we do have the science. For example, here in the US, we've been able to double our life expectancy in less than 200 years. And I see a big part of that is because we do have abundant healthy food supply that's enabled that to happen. But in order for us to use these technologies, we have to have laws and policies in place that enable their implementation.
That's a great segue to one of the things that I wanted to speak with today's session. Again, drawing from some of your past experience, what are some of those laws, policies? What specifically needs to be on the books or needs to be amended to make this more efficient, both for the United States, but also, of course, globally?
As we talk about like the progression of science and technology, especially in the agriculture industry, I love this quote that my mom taught me by Maya Angelou. Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, you do better. And so we've used science in order to, double our life expectancy. We've used it in order to develop our natural resources. And in that process, we've still been able to find ways to have a healthy ecosystem for our environments, our lands, and our waters. And as we continue to grow, as Jonathan just mentioned here, our populations are going to continue to expand. So that means that there is going to be an impact on our environment. We are going to see greater interactions between wildlife and people. And so how do you address that when you have more development that's happening? So you first mitigate. Well, you first find ways to avoid what that impact is. And then you find a way to minimize it. And if you can't do either of those, then that's when you mitigate. And you have mitigation banks that are used, every day around the US. And those are ways that are developed under a regulatory process in which you find ways to offset whatever adverse ecological impacts that you've had with your work. But it's all based on what the science tells you to do. And what I found was, when I was director, there's not a lot of transparency. And when you don't have transparency, you don't have trust. And so that was one of the reasons behind, founding AVC Global, one of the co-founders. And we use blockchain technology. And our goal was to put more money into the farmers' pockets by removing the middleman and the agriculture supply chain and bringing transparency to that. And then one of our spinoffs was medical value chain, or MVC. And that's where we're working with nation governments to ensure that counterfeit drugs aren't entering into that country. And so the goal is, let's take those digital technologies and apply it to conservation. If we can bring transparency to that process, then we now have more money to save our wildlife, to save our environment for future generations.
Paula, I can't help but feel that Maya Angelou quote and the motto of knowing better and doing better should be inscribed across SAS's walls, right? Because that's what you're doing with your data and analytics, right? It's helping people, it's helping with that transparency to know better, to do better. Can you talk a little bit about some of the agriculture-related projects that you're working on, how you partner with technologists and innovators like App Harvest? Knowing that I don't think you guys have an official partnership. I'm not trying to put that out there.
Would love to, but I would love to spend the rest of the evening. We would miss the temptations. And thank you for your work with App Harvest. We see such a tremendous opportunity in the startup community to really help from a scalability standpoint. And we believe, and I'm sure you both agree. Anything the human eye can see, a computer model can be developed and be deployed to do, but then how do you scale it? And so with all the funding that's going into this industry and the need for it, considering it's one of the few industries that have not been digitized, and then it's still unbelievable to think about the 60% of the data that's being collected in the industry is unused. So there's so much opportunity for positive disruption. And thank you for being a positive disruptor and helping. And we have programs to support the startup community. We have been partnering with venture capital firms in support of these programs, to help their startups, providing software and services to really help with scalability. I'm very much committed to do so because it's something that's so important.
Jonathan, you made a big splash here in Kentucky, both with the innovative and positively disruptive technology, but also as a local entrepreneur, as somebody who's changing that ecosystem a bit, as an employer, right? Talk to us about this Lexington special sauce and what you're seeing or what you need to scale.
Well, I definitely got a lot of, it was great seeing Nate here earlier and got a lot of early advice from him, but this concept that innovative ideas can come from anywhere in the world, and they're not exclusive to Boston, New York, and San Francisco, where 80% of the venture capital goes. We started this company in a garage in Eastern Kentucky, and here we are. And Nate's company was founded here as well. And if we're going to close the climate gap, we have to make it inclusive. We can't make it about just a few cities with Ivy League schools, with a few companies that are all getting the funding. That's where the divide comes from. And we're working in an area of the country where a lot of people would question, would you get the support for what you're doing? Yeah, we do. I mean, people just they want to be at the table. They want to be at the conversation, and they want to be a part of it. And we've been very fortunate to build our organization here, and I think have one of those forward-leaning thought leadership conversations. But we're doing it in coffee shops in Moorhead, Kentucky, and Harlan, Kentucky, and all across the region. So great ideas can come from anywhere, and I hope we're a small example of that here. And I think again for our agriculture problems, it's the next generation the future of farming is not going to be in Boston. So if we want to solve our agriculture problems, then we better get rural America and the rural parts of the world involved, because they're the ones that are going to do it.
I appreciate that. I'm from Iowa originally, and you see all these great bumper stickers that just say ANF, so America Needs Farmers, right? And always thinking about having citizen stakeholders at the table. And you get half a point for that almost food pun for bringing that up. So we've got 1/2, all right. So in the remaining minute, I'm coming back to Concordia's mission of partnerships for positive social impact. And I'd love for each of our panelists to just in a few words say, what are you looking for in a partner if you're trying to solve one piece of this food security ag tech challenge set in America? Where would you start?
I'd say it's the innovation. It's people that are able to think outside the box, figuring out that we do have needs, and there's ways to be able to bring those assets that every person has, and figuring out that there is common ground, and let's find something new.
So thinking about things differently, with different people putting in inputs to get a different output.
Exactly, kind of like using that technology, our digital technologies.
Great. Jonathan?
Yeah, execution at scale, whether it's policymakers or on Wall Street. We need to grow more food in the next 30 years than the entire 10,000 years of human existence combined, and we're not talking about it. So execution at scale, the technologies are available. It's a lack of will and a lack of imagination why we're not doing it.
Okay. Paul?
I would say breaking down silos to create very strategic partnerships, and this is a great way to convene to have these discussions because it's so important. But then to follow through with really true strategic partnerships to take the action that's needed.
Most definitely. Well, I want to thank our panelists for this conversation, and I encourage folks, if they're inspired, to, as they come out, to just clamor towards that green room entranceway, talk about those partnerships, talk about that execution at scale, and talk about being there in the room and honestly, I know so little about blockchain, so could just talk about that, I guess. But thank you so much to our panelists, and we'll move on to the next discussion.
Thank you.